Hello, Internet. I am Chamomile, I have a GM's Guide, and this is that GM's Guide. But instead of regular, it's a YouTube video. Now, just about every GM's Guide, from the chapter on the subject in official books in the most popular RPGs in the world, to the How to GM posts that get submitted to Reddit by someone who's only been doing it for 6 months, they'll all mention that the GM should change rules and ignore the advice in the guide whenever it's appropriate. That's true, but left by itself, it's also basically just completely sidestepping all responsibility for the actual quality of the advice. If you follow our advice and it turns out badly for you, that's because you didn't follow our advice to not follow our advice. No guide can ever encompass the entirety of all situations faced by every GM who ever reads it. Despite being the length of a short novel, in written form anyway, this one isn't even getting close. So there'll definitely be times when the advice in this guide does not apply to a specific situation, and a GM should ignore it. The question, though, is when. How can you tell when you should ignore the advice and when you should follow it? And the answer is, you should ignore the advice when you have a good reason to. That sounds tautological, but the idea here is that if you can explain to a hypothetical observer why the rule isn't going to work for you, then you're probably in a situation where the rule really isn't going to work and you should ignore it. All skills have a dogma to them, a set of rules that you just follow because that is the best way to do things that has been discovered in general, and you follow those rules until you have enough true expertise to understand the limitations of that dogma and see how it doesn't apply to your specific situation. You have to understand the rules before you can break them is a cliche because it's true. If you have a reason to break a rule, a real reason, not a shallow non-reason like that's not how we do things here, or I just like it better this other way, or trust me, I've got a hunch. If you have a real reason, then you've probably found a limitation of the rules and you should probably break that rule for that reason. This is true not just of the rules given in this guide or of GM's guides in general, but for almost all rules, for any skill. What does it mean to have fun? That's not a Zen koan, it's an analytic question for anyone who wants to get better at making a tabletop game more fun, whether that's as a designer, a game master, or even as a player. Rolling a natural 20 is fun, and being part of a well-executed plot twist that reveals friends as enemies and enemies as friends and the clues were there all along if only you had put them together, that's fun. Masterfully executing an intricate plan to topple a kingdom using nothing but twine and color spray, that's fun. But they're all fun in extremely different ways. The visceral thrill of the natural 20, the satisfaction of seeing your plan come together, the surprise and excitement of seeing the GM's plan come together, those are all completely different kinds of fun. And if you want your players to have fun, you need to figure out what kind of fun they're looking for. Coming from the other direction, if you already have a game and you want people to have fun with it, you need to make sure that they're looking for the kind of fun you're offering. In game design, fun has been codified into 8 distinct elements, which you may recognize from the Extra Credits episode or the Angry DM article about the Extra Credits episode. These elements are fantasy, narrative, challenge, sense pleasure, fellowship, expression, discovery, and abnegation. Any game that tries to be a perfect combination of all 8 is going to fail, partly because some of them are opposed. You can have abnegation and challenge in the same game, but not really. But mostly because you just can't be good at 8 things at once. Trying to be good at all 8 will dilute your efforts away from the things you're good at and towards things you're not, and you'll end up with a game where you have all 8 elements but they're all kind of mediocre. You're much better off focusing on 2, 3, or maybe 4 things to get right, rather than having 8 things which are present. So the 3 we're focusing on for this guide are going to be the first 3 we listed: fantasy, narrative, and challenge. That's not because they're the best kind, it's because we need to have focus, and these are the 3 that I feel qualified to talk about. If you want me to talk about a game that relies on abnegation, expression, and discovery, well, the best I can offer is a couple of educated guesses. So the first element we'll be focusing on is fantasy. Fantasy here refers not to the genre, but rather to the idea that you are immersing yourself into a life other than your own, that you're playing a role. Whether that's the role of a fantasy knight, a 1930s investigator into the occult, or a near-future cyberpunk. The power fantasy is the most common fantasy in role-playing games, but by no means the only one. A game broiling with political drama might see characters regularly forced to compromise their principles, sacrifice one thing to get another. That's not really a power fantasy, but it still has players playing a role and immersing themselves in the world. A game that has players disempowered as some of the weakest, most abused people in the setting who are mostly just trying to get through another day without getting killed. That's still a fantasy, because you're still playing a role, but it's certainly not a power fantasy. Our prioritization of fantasy is the reason why we endorse designing more open-ended scenarios over more linear ones. It's why we'll talk about things like immersion and how the world should react to players in a believable way. Running a believable world is our highest priority, but it's only slightly ahead of our second element, which is narrative. Narrative is a good story. It's one of the elements of fun that doesn't require an interactive medium at all. Compelling character arcs and surprising plot twists are the bread and butter of movies and books. For narrative, we'll mostly be discussing pacing, theme, and character arcs, because anything else is almost impossible to set up in the chaotic environment of a collaborative, improvised story. In an interactive medium, narrative and fantasy can often be opposed to one another, with character arcs cut short or pacing disrupted because of player action. In these cases, we prefer to err on the side of fantasy. A single missed beat or aborted arc won't destroy a narrative, but a single ass pull to prevent that usually will destroy immersion. Exposing the reality that you can, and evidently will, ignore player choices or sensible world building whenever you think it's important. Once that illusion is shattered, it's almost impossible to rebuild it. The third element is challenge. Now, that's not to say that we advocate running the Dark Souls of D&D or anything. Most GMs who pride themselves on killing players often tumble down the slippery slope of setting narrative, fantasy, and everything else on fire, a sacrifice upon the altar of their fearsome reputation. The element of challenge is not about any particular level of challenge, it's about objectivity. Total objectivity is impossible because the GM is a human being, but that doesn't mean that you can't strive to be more objective. A GM who tries to be more objective is giving players more power over the story, because they are not invalidating player successes. For example, if clever players find a way to skip several encounters, a GM might try to railroad them back into those encounters because they really like those encounters and they want the players to see them. But that's invalidating challenge. It's stealing the win away from the players. They won super hard. They won so hard they got to skip over some content altogether because they were clever. And the GM is taking that away from them. That invalidates challenge. On the other hand, a GM who tries to invalidate player failures is also invalidating challenge. When all roads lead to success, players paradoxically have less power, because the GM has decided in advance what the results will be, regardless of player action or what the dice say. So even though those results are good for the players, player input is still being ignored, and that's not challenge either. The fun of challenge is to look at a kingdom saved, a villain defeated, and peace restored, and knowing that this happened because you made it happen, not just because you showed up and fate mandated you could never lose. A lot of people will listen to this and think it sounds awful that the GM should cheat in favor of the players, and that's just a different style. That's abnegation as opposed to challenge. And like I mentioned a bit ago, abnegation and challenge are very often in conflict with one another. You really have to pick one or the other, and we pick challenge. Abnegation is a different style, and we won't be covering it here, but if that floats your boat, then have fun with it. A special mention to fellowship. Fellowship is the element of fun that comes from hanging out with friends, doing something together, and just enjoying their company. Fellowship is probably the most important element of fun to a tabletop RPG, but we're not going to discuss it because this isn't a video game and we aren't making a matchmaking service for you or anything. We don't have to figure out how to design our LFG system to try and encourage good pickup groups. You're playing with your friends, and we assume that your friends are already your friends, and you don't need us to tell you how to be friends with them. So, effective fellowship is something we assume that you've taken care of already. So, prioritizing these three elements, fantasy, narrative, and challenge, it's something we do because we have to prioritize something, or else we'll dilute our advice to the point of being too broad and too complicated to be useful to anyone. Because these are the three that I'm best at, they're the three that we're going to be talking about for the rest of this guide. See you there.